Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the launch of the second National Integrity Index on public bodies, examining the adoption and disclosure practices of policies and procedures aimed at stopping corruption by 40 of Ireland's most important public bodies, where people will be just joining us, and we'll take some time to talk you through the background of the study and introduce you to us. And there will be plenty of time for questions and answers. And if at any stage during the presentation you have any questions, please let us know. You can use the chat and Q&A, and if you would like to, you can also put up your hand and ask a question, and we'll do our best to let you in. It's unlikely I'll be in a position to address any queries on individual organizations, but by now public bodies should have full details of their individual scorecards. The final report, which is being completed, has been sent to you. It's also available online at www.transparency.ie, where you'll also find interactive tables which you can browse and resources that you can access during the session and thereafter. I should also note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel afterwards. I should also take this opportunity to thank our donors at the Community Foundation for Ireland, who have supported this research since 2017. I should also note that the findings of this research are Transparency International Ireland's alone, as are its conclusions. But we'd like to thank the Community Foundation for Ireland again for all their support over this time. Before we go any further, I should briefly explain who we are by way of background to this study. Briefly, for those of you who aren't familiar with Transparency International, it is an independent non-profit organization with a presence in about 100 countries. It undertakes research and evidence-based advocacy worldwide and at a national level aimed at stopping corruption. And it's probably best known for the Corruption Perceptions Index, which measures relative levels of perceived corruption around the world, and is published generally every year. We also operate the Speak Up helpline for those raising concerns of wrongdoing and seeking legal advice in making a protected disclosure, and conduct research on whistleblowing, lobbying, standards of public office, and money laundering and asset recovery, or recovery of corrupt assets laundered in Ireland. Which brings us to the National Integrity Index itself. And this project is informed by our previous work on national integrity systems, which examine the strength and weaknesses of institutions in addressing corruption-related risks. And it is also inspired by the work of our colleagues elsewhere in Europe and overseas, including TI Slovakia, which has published similar indices on local government transparency, TI UK, which has done similar work, and Transparency International's Transparency in Reporting on Anti-Corruption Index, which examines the adoption and disclosure practices of some of the world's leading companies. We have drawn on these studies and their own analysis to develop a methodology which pays attention to the adoption and disclosure practices of anti-corruption policies and procedures in public and private institutions. And we began in 2018 with an analysis of local authorities. That was followed up in 2019 with another study on local authorities, which monitored progress since over the previous year. And then we conducted studies on disclosure practices in the private sector in Ireland, semi-state, non-commercial public bodies and universities in late 2021. And we conclude the series, this round of studies, with an analysis of non-commercial public bodies. Ideally, the findings will be periodically updated to highlight and promote progress in the disclosure and adoption of anti-corruption policies and procedures, or related policies and procedures. We've also visualized improvements, as you see from these slides, in disclosure practices. Those local authorities in a darker shade of red performed relatively poorly in 2018, and noted a considerable variation of points received in 2018 when the average score was 46%, and then noted an overall improvement of around 9% in 2019, when 23 councils improved on their performance on the previous year. There are 5 good reasons, and I won't go through them all, why we conduct this research. The first and second of which are to help protect organizations against reputational and legal liabilities. The aim of the project is to identify good practice that can inform policies and procedures, which then can in turn just demonstrate or help demonstrate accountability and foster stakeholder and public trust in those institutions. It should be noted that more than a third of those surveyed in Ireland believed corruption is quite or a very big problem. That was according to our Global Corruption Barometer in the European Union, published in 2021, and the findings of which are on our website. And given that public bodies are responsible for delivering public services and in awarding some 17 billion euros of public contracts each year, as well as the role that they play in determining and implementing public policy in a range of issues, they are especially vulnerable to corruption risks. And this can be summed up using the following illustration, which shows that the risk of corruption can be determined by a combination of factors. It can be calculated as a function of incentive, opportunity, and inclination, which is limited by external oversight, i.e. the possibility that a person will be held to account for his or her behavior. And in other words, we're looking at promoting robust anti-corruption and risk management programs in order to address those incentives and opportunities for corruption. It should be noted again that the aim of this, as with other NII studies, is to assess policies and disclosure procedures addressing corruption-related risks, and to highlight good practice in areas for improvement. I need to make it crystal clear that it is not an assessment of compliance or a commentary on the effectiveness of an organization's implementation of policies. It is not a forensic examination, and nor is it an analysis of actual levels of corruption, which is impossible to undertake. And as we noted already, the study builds on and adapts methodology to a local context. It identifies organizations that are broadly representative of different functions in the public service, and it measures them against 30 indicators under 5 categories, with a possible 0, 0.5 or 1 point awarded for each criteria met in each indicator. The organizations were drawn from the CSO Register of Public Bodies. It was based on relevant information disclosed online by organizations through their websites during April and May of 2022. Organizations were then sent preliminary scorecards and given until the end of May, 23rd of May, to update any information that they already had, or to publish information that they had to hand on their websites. We also then accepted any corrections right up to the publication of the report, and took a little bit longer than we'd expected, hence the delay in publishing it this year. So on to the results and findings. So if we look at the overall findings, we see an average score of 49% for all public bodies, with the highest average score for open government or open governance, and the lowest score for responsible political engagement. And we'll compare those overall scores to commercial public bodies and universities in a moment. And as we can see here, and you'll see on the interactive table on our website, the highest score was received by Bord Iascaigh Mhóra, followed by the Public Appointments Service, the Central Bank of Ireland, and the Commission for Communication and Regulation, all of whom scored over 70%. Non-commercial public bodies fared better compared to commercial semi-states and universities, with the latter performing better on with commercial semi-states and universities performing better on the anti-corruption and open governance indicators. Non-commercial public bodies performed better elsewhere. It should be noted, however, that semi-state public commercial public bodies and universities were not given an opportunity to publish their policies before their disclosure practices were measured. The sharing of preliminary scores in the study was unique to this cohort of organizations, and it's a methodology or an aspect or an element of the methodology that we'll carry forward into future studies. But it should be also borne in mind that each organization, irrespective of their sector, has been measured or assessed consistently with its peers. If we look at anti-corruption programs, again, we see Bord Iascaigh Mhóra coming out on top. But we find a relatively poor average score of 33%, with this widest spread 0 to 94%. And there was very little information on broader anti-corruption measures. So, for example, there was very little information available from public bodies on the training they provided, the monitoring of programs for effectiveness, due diligence, or particularly due diligence on third parties such as purchasers and suppliers. However, more information was available on procedures for gifts and hospitalities and procedures for handling of conflicts of interest. Some organizations, including Bord Iascaigh Mhóra, performed pretty well with it, and in the case of BIM, they scored 94% in this indicator, and they helped set a standard for disclosure practices by making it easy to access information on their policies and procedures. And we've done this by listing policy procedures on a dedicated web page. They have policies and procedures on corruption and bribery, conflicts of interest, and gifts and hospitality, and links to all these governance policies are available on its website, and the links will be available on our website under or on the report and in the report itself, where we highlight good practice under each of the 30 indicators. We noted that organizations perform much better on the financial transparency indicator overall, with 36 out of 40 having disclosed financial statements for the previous year. Information on procurement procedures and how to access details of tenders were common, but the degree of detail on these procedures varied significantly. However, very few freedom of information organizations met the model publication scheme requirements, requiring or publishing details of contracts and payment orders, and a relatively small number of organizations published information on asset disposal procedures. One good example was worth highlighting here in particular, and that was the website of the Environmental Protection Agency, which was updated on a quarterly basis and included contracts with a value above 25,000 euros, and a description of the contract, name of the contractor, start and end dates, and the specific value of those contracts. Likewise, most organizations could be considered strong performance in the open governance category, with information on board composition, organizational structure, relationship to the state, all that information being widely available, and 6 organizations scored 100% on this indicator. However, the publication of the minutes of board meetings was inconsistent, and there's indeed some room for improvement in terms of accessibility. Few organizations are publishing dedicated corporate governance or ethics web pages as a platform for all relevant documents, and this is a trend that we've seen across numerous bodies, which we have covered in this series. One example, a good practice example under this indicator is offered by Uras Nageltukta, which showed or had a website listing its board members with profiles for each one. Similarly, on Garda Síochána, although not having technically having a board, included a page on its senior leadership team and included its members' profiles, or its the senior leadership team's profiles on its website. Board BIA had a web page on corporate governance with links to its code of practice for governance of state bodies, its code of conduct, and material on protected disclosures, freedom of information, and procurement, all on one dedicated section of its site. The one area perhaps requiring the most attention was responsible political engagement, with limited information published on involvement with advocacy groups, and very few organizations publishing their chief executives' meetings diaries, and very few references to, let alone detailed policies on, addressing the practice of revolving doors, whereby staff move from the public into the private sector. And amongst the good practice examples here were the Valuation Office's website, which had a dedicated page on the regulation of lobbying, which included a list of designated public officials and a link to its lobbying code. While the Higher Education Authority advises former staff to recognise that the acceptance of positions following the cessation of employment with the HEA can give rise to potential conflict of interest and confidentiality concerns. So while there's little that the HEA can do, it does make its staff, former members of staff, conscious of the need to respect confidentiality and to be aware of any potential conflicts of interest that might arise from their movement or their employment by a new employer. In addition, the central bank had published the governor's diary on an annual basis up to June 2022. Similarly, the revenue commissioners publish its board diaries on its website. In comparison, assessed organizations, in comparison to responsible public, responsible political engagement, assessed organizations fared better when evaluated against whistleblowing indicators, and 39 out of 40 organizations published their protected disclosures annual report as required, although not all were fully compliant with the statutory deadlines. We found, generally speaking, that there was a lack of detail on external reporting channels and on training for employees handling disclosures. While some organizations designated as prescribed recipients for disclosures published public policies for handling those disclosures, they didn't publish their internal protected disclosure policies. And a good example here amongst the cohort was the Land Development Agency, which had published its protected disclosure policy on its website, and which applied to both current and former workers of the agency, whether on permanent or temporarily employed by the agency, whether retired. It also made them or currently serving. It also made it clear that the policy applied to ex-workers, independent contractors, consultants, trainees, and agency workers. Also made it clear that the penalization of employees who make a disclosure will not be tolerated, and the agency also outlined internal and external channels through which their workers can make a protected disclosure. So overall, it was a relatively detailed and comprehensive policy, which might serve as an example for a number of its peers. TUSLA as well published its protected disclosures annual reports on a dedicated page of its website, and those reports contained greater detail, a greater degree or level of detail than most reports of its type, with detail on the number of disclosures received and the actions taken in response to those disclosures. So if we move on to the recommendations, you'll see we make 8 recommendations, starting with or by calling on all organizations to publish governance-related documents and to make them easily accessible to the public online, to make disclosure of policies meaningful through monitoring and reporting on performance of those policies and procedures, to make a high-level commitment against corruption and bribery. This is not always the case. We will often find that organizations are stating that they comply with the law, but it's equally important to make a clear commitment to address corruption and bribery-related risks, to put it on the compliance agenda, to make sure that it is a specific and measurable risk that the organization is committed to addressing. It's also important to equip staff with training and resources to implement anti-corruption measures and to report on those measures to its stakeholders where possible on the organization's website. We also call on organizations to adopt and publish a comprehensive, proactive, risk-based anti-corruption and bribery program that involves undertaking risk analysis that's particular to that organization, ensuring that management and the board or governance of that organization have full sight of that and the measures in place to address those risks, and where possible to publish those measures so that it's public stakeholders, particularly important for public bodies to do, their public stakeholders are aware of measures in place to address those risks. It's also important that organizations publish clear information on asset disposal and procurement procedures and to disclose details of procurement contracts awarded. And we saw examples earlier on that can be drawn from, and those examples are again on the website and in the report. Another area which is largely overlooked by public bodies, but it's one that we believe needs to be needs or deserves greater attention, is around engagement with lobbyists and the private sector. And it's important to have policy dealing and procedures dealing with engagement with lobbyists and making a clear statement around political neutrality for the public to see, and for its for other stakeholders as well to be aware of. And finally, we're calling on organizations that organizations to adopt a protected disclosures or whistleblowing policy that does not include a good faith requirement. It's important that the protected disclosure policy isn't just detailed or comprehensive, but one that also avoids using language that could serve to deter workers from coming forward. And it's important to consult with legal teams to ensure that the terminology used in those policies is consistent with legislation. We understand the legislation, the Protected Disclosures Amendment Act, will be commenced in early in the new year. So it gives organizations some time to review those policies and procedures. So that's that for now. Thanks for listening, and again, thank you for participating, for those organizations that have participated in this and engaged with us in providing information and feedback on this. We hope it is a valuable exercise for you. We've already seen measurable improvement in the disclosure practices over the last few months in organizations that have been assessed for this exercise, for this project. And going forward, we'd like to think that we will see further improvements of the adoption and disclosure of policies, procedures aimed at tackling corruption, and we're willing to engage and happy to make ourselves available if your organization is looking for advice and feedback on how it can improve its policies, procedures, and disclosure practices. So happy to take any questions. I see we have maybe one, and there's a comment from Alan. He says he's disappointed that our views about publishing the CEO's diary were not taken into account, given the highly sensitive nature of many interactions. Alan's at TUSLA. Yeah, so I had discussed this with TUSLA already and made it clear, as can be seen from the diary of the Governor of the Central Bank, It can be published from an Outlook calendar, and no details are required of specific meetings with any individual whereby sensitive information would be disclosed, but it would equally be important for the public to see what organizations, what the leadership of organizations are doing on a weekly, if not daily basis. But we take your point on that, Alan. I think that those are all the questions in the Q&A. If we have any questions, if anyone would like to put their hand and or to add a comment in the chat or Q&A. So Matty has asked, could you please say how Ireland's situation is in comparison to other countries in Europe? Well, we haven't conducted these, we haven't seen publication of similar studies on public bodies in other European countries yet. This is the first, as far as we're aware, in the EU, certainly the first study of this kind published by a Transparency International chapter. However, when looking at the integrity systems analysis of other countries, we can find that we have relatively robust checks and balances at an executive and legislative level, relatively strong judiciary or independent judiciary. We can see the erosion of these checks and balances in a number of countries in mainland Europe, and it tends to do so just across the water in the UK. What it does is serve to those examples serve to highlight the fragility of these integrity systems and the importance of having independent or strong checks and balances and independent institutions working with one another to serve the public interest and to protect it from the abuse of entrusted power. It's difficult to say how strong or how strong organizations are at a public bodies, or how well public bodies are performing in Ireland compared to their peers elsewhere. But it's perhaps something we could look at if the funding were available for our European chapters to undertake similar studies. It would be an interesting exercise, but I'm afraid I don't have that information to hand. We don't have any more questions. Please feel free again, if you should be able to put your hand up. If we can, if you'd like to come in and ask a question, feel free to do so. Okay, well, if there aren't any more questions, I'm happy to wrap it up there, and to thank you again for your time and for listening. Like I said, this presentation will be made available in PDF form by email to those who would like it. It'll also be made available on our website, and the presentation itself, the recording, will be available on YouTube as well for anyone who wants to watch it back. If we don't have any more questions or comments, I'll conclude here. Thank you again. Thanks to our donors, Community Foundation for Ireland, for supporting this initiative. And I hope to see you back again next year when we can conduct an update of this and other studies in the series. Thanks to Donica, who co-edited the report, our assistant researchers, and Catherine Lawler, who was the lead researcher on this project and has since moved on from TI Ireland. Thanks to everyone for the participation again. And like I said, hope to see you again in the not too distant future. And please feel free to drop us a line if you'd like any more information on this or any other project. Thank you again. Bye-bye.